Greetings. We are the Ministry of the Real Truth, and it was suggested us by someone in our comments that to truly know or understand what atheism is, that we should read this book, Atheism, the Case Against God by George H. Smith from the Skeptic's Bookshelf, because they suggested this is the only book one should read on atheism, possibly to fully understand it, to know what it's all about, because definitions aren't good enough. Instead of using definitions, we should read this book. Okay, no problem there. So we decided, we actually told him we would read this book, so we're going to read this book, and we're going to do a video on it to see what it says. Okay, who was George H. Smith, first of all? George H. Smith, George Hamilton Smith, February 10, 1949 to April 8, 2022, so he died last year. Was an American author, editor, educator and speaker, known for his writings on atheism. Okay, and this is what it's defined as. Atheism in the broader sense is an absence of belief in the existence of deities, a god or any gods. Less broadly, atheism is a rejection of the belief that any deities exist. In an even narrower sense, atheism is specifically the position that there are no deities. And libertarianism, a political philosophy that upholds liberty as a core value. Libertarians seek to maximize autonomy and political freedom and minimize the state's encroachment on and violations of individual liberties, emphasizing the rule of law, pluralism, cosmopolitan, whatever that may be, whatever that continues to say. Biography. Smith grew up in Tucson, Arizona, USA, etc., etc. He secured a contract from Nash Publishing, then located in Los Angeles, to produce a book on atheism. The finished product was his first book, Atheism, the Case Against God, in 1974. Smith began teaching in the 1970s, first under the auspices of his own Forum for Philosophical Studies, with offices on Sunset Boulevard in Los Angeles, USA. Later under the auspices of the Cato Institute, an American libertarian think tank headquartered in Washington, D.C., USA. It was founded in 1997 by Ed Crane, Murray Rothbard, and Charles Koch, Chairman of the Board and Chief Executive Officer of Koch Industries, and so forth. And the Institute for Humane Studies, IHS, a non-profit organisation that promotes the teaching and research of classical liberalism in higher education in the United States. IHS offers funding, opportunities, programs and events for faculty and graduate students, etc. For nearly 20 years, from the mid-1970s to the mid-1990s, he spent his summers teaching political philosophy, the philosophical study of government, addressing questions about the nature, scope and legitimacy of public agent and institutions, and the relationships between them. And American political and intellectual history to university students at seminars sponsored by Cato Institute and IHS. During the 1980s, Smith worked for more than 6 years as the general editor of Knowledge Products, a national-based company that produced educational audio recordings in philosophy, history, economics and current affairs. During those years, in addition to his duties as editor, Smith was also the primary scriptwriter for Knowledge Products' Great Political Thinkers series. These recordings have been used widely in college classrooms. Since 1971, more than 100 of Smith's articles and books reviews have appeared in a wide range of publications, including the New York Times, the Arizona Daily Star, Reason Magazine, Free Inquiry, The Humanist Inquiry, Cato Policy Report, Liberty, The Voluntarist, and so forth. He wrote a weekly column on libertarian and classical liberal thought for libertarianism.org, a website operated by Cato. He presented his arguments in favour of non-political participation in his party dialogue, neither bullets nor ballots, considering it a practice of power through rhetoric, even though its activity is carried out by parties, in favour of freedom and justice, since every party exercises the coercive power of the state, whether it uses it or not, and always under political commitments. Mistrusting all political activity, he separated libertarianism from partisanship. A partisan is a committed member of a political party. In multi-party systems, the term is used for persons who strongly support their party's policies and are reluctant to compromise with political opponents, whereas the libertarianism is different, and so forth. Okay, that's a little bit of information on him. Okay, let's have a look at Michael Martin and his review. Michael Martin reviews Smith. Okay, editor's note: this article was originally published in Teaching Philosophy 5.2, April 1982, page 152 to 55. The page numbers below show the position of the text within that pagination scheme. That's Michael Martin, Boston University, who states, this book is a hard-hitting attack against belief in the Christian God as well as all other supernatural beings called gods in the book, intended primarily for laymen, everyday ordinary Joe, and consequently relatively free from technical philosophical argument and jargon. This book might well be used in a beginning course in the philosophy of religion as a fair representation of contemporary atheistic thought. Students would, Michael Martin believes, find it more provocative and challenging than some other treatment. They may be technically more sophisticated. The author's direct and forceful way of making his points has great appeal. Clearly, it is a book written with deep intellectual passion. However, there are some limitations to the book as an introduction to atheism, and teachers of philosophy might wish to supplement it with other works. First, Smith's critical treatment of the standard arguments for the existence of God is incomplete. Variants of the cosmological and technological arguments are critically evaluated, but the ontological argument and other arguments for the existence of God are not considered. 1. And it must be a reference. Okay. Second, the argument against the existence of God from the existence of evil is by the author's own admission not treated in depth. The author believes, incorrectly Michael Martin thinks, that relative to other difficulties with belief in God, the problem of evil is not important. 80. Third, argument against the existence of God using some version of the verifiability theory of meaning are not developed at all. There is another point that should be mentioned that may, unjustifiably, Michael Martin believes, make some philosophy teachers hesitate to use the book. According to information provided on the back cover, Smith studied philosophy at the University of Arizona, but it is unclear how much formal training in philosophy he has had. He has, however, been greatly influenced by Ayn Rand and Nathaniel Branden. Rand and Branden are cited and quoted more frequently in the book than anyone else. And on the back cover, Smith is billed as a student of the libertarian point of view and co-editor of a libertarian periodical. However, Smith's libertarian, this is probably on page 153, views are absent from the present work, and his quotations for Rand and Branden have nothing to do with their political views. Other atheists might have been cited and quoted just as easily, atheists with completely different political views. Unfortunately, in part 1, Smith adopts some of Branden's arguments for the non-existence of God, which seem to Michael Martin to be dubious. On the other hand, in part 4, he relies on Rand's views about the science of ethics, which seem to Martin not to be dubious. In any case, these views seem neutral with respect to a libertarian position. Space does not permit Martin to evaluate critically all of Smith's interesting thesis, so he decided he'd therefore discuss parts 2, 3 and 4 of the book very briefly and limit most of his critical remarks to part 1, which contains Smith's major arguments for believing that God or a God does not exist. It should be noted, however, that part 2, a critique of faith, and part 4, a critique of theological ethics, in particular the ethics of Jesus, are worthwhile and fascinating. Part 3, a critique of some traditional arguments for God, is less original and useful. In the first part of the book, Smith argues that atheism is simply the absence of theistic belief. So from the fact that someone is an atheist, nothing can be inferred about any of his or her positive beliefs. Presumably, nothing can be inferred either about the absence of any belief except the absence of theistic belief. In fact, throughout the book, Smith seems to use atheism in a broader sense than this. He seems to assume that atheism is the absence of any belief in any supernatural being or beings, deism, polytheism, etc. In any case, given Smith's minimal definition of atheism, agnosticism is not an alternative to atheism, since agnosticism is the denial of knowledge or of a god or gods. We always thought it was like you don't know, you don't have that information, you're not sure, because that's what But the Ehrman said as an agnostic atheist. That's how he explained it. And we looked at the actual words in the Greek of Gnostic, gnosis, and it was to know, to have, something like that. Okay, so agnostic would be not having that knowledge, or denying that knowledge of a god or gods. You're not really sure. That's what it's defined as. You're not too sure that there is a god or not. You need to define that word and find the etymology, the origins of that word. So you won't take it out of context. You'll fully understand it, and then you won't take it out of context. Thus, one can be agnostic atheist, a person who does not have a theistic belief and who denies that knowledge of supernatural beings is possible. Well, we found through defining them, those words, agnostic and atheist, that one is not knowing, not having that knowledge, and the other is a non-belief in any god or gods, that they don't exist. In regards to those religious theists, a person who does not have a theistic belief and who denies that knowledge of supernatural beings is possible. One can also be an implicit atheist, a person, for example a young child, who does not believe in a god or gods, but who has not explicitly rejected the belief that a god or gods exist. So that's an implicit atheist. So I guess if someone says, oh, a child was born an atheist, I don't think so. He just doesn't know about God yet. The child hasn't declared, I don't believe in a God or any gods. Or one can be an explicit atheist, a person who has explicitly rejected belief in a god or gods, the motive for this rejection being either rational or irrational. Probably page 17. Unfortunately, later on in the book, Smith's own restrictions on the concept of atheism seem to have been forgotten. He maintains that explicit atheism is a consequence of commitment to rationality, page 98, and that an atheist does not accept the premise that the universe requires an explanation, 231. But by Smith's own admission, an explicit atheist could be irrationally motivated. And this guy Martin, this writer, saw no reason, given Smith's construal, why an atheist might not believe that the universe requires an explanation, although not one in terms of a god or gods. Although, according to the minimal definition of atheism suggested by Smith, this is suggested by Smith, an atheist does not have to believe that a god or gods do not exist. An atheist does not have to believe that a god or gods do not exist. The atheism actually defended in this book is a stronger version. Smith argues that the claim that a god or gods exist is contradictory, and that the concept of the Christian God is contradictory. Smith seems to believe, in other words, that he provides reasons for believing that a claim that God or a gods or gods exist could not be true, since, presumably, a contradictory claim could not be true, and a contradictory concept cannot refer to any existing entity. Consider first his argument, apparently based on Brandon's view, that to assert that a God exists is contradictory, page 41 to 44. First, he argues that anything that exists has a specific nature. Second, he argues that a specific nature is determined by natural law. Third, he argues that since a God by definition transcends natural law, a God does not have a specific nature. Finally, he concludes that a God cannot exist since it has not a specific nature. Consequently, to assert that a God exists is contradictory. One debatable premise in this part of the argument is surely that natural law determines an entity's specific nature. Second, he argues that it is contradictory to claim that God or gods exist and are unknowable. His argument is this: this is page 154, if a God is unknowable, it cannot be known to exist. But to assert that a God exists is to claim that this God is known to exist. This argument has problems. Surely one can assert that a God exists and yet not claim to know that a God exists. One might only claim to believe that a God exists. Further, one might claim that a God's nature is unknowable and yet claim a God's existence is knowable, except when existence of a God is included in the nature of a God. But this inclusion would mean that existence was a predicate. There is no reason to suppose that a believer in a God is necessarily committed to this dubious ontological view. To be sure, if one did claim that a God's existence is knowable and a God's nature is unknowable and indeed incomprehensible, one would have no basis for worshipping this God or attributing any moral attributes to the God. This would be an extremely serious problem for followers of religious practice connected with this God. But it is one thing to claim this and quite another thing to claim that. Asserting that a God is unknowable is contradictory. Smith's attempt to show that the concept of the Christian God is contradictory is, Martin believes, also unsuccessful on page 67 to 76. For example, he attempts to show that God's omnipotence is incompatible with God's action. An omnipotent being would not need to act, but the Christian God does act. He also attempts to show that God's omnipotence is incompatible with God's omniscience. If God is omnipotent, he could change the future. If God is omniscient, he could know the future. But if the future could be changed, God could not know the future. It is impossible here to evaluate these arguments in detail, but they are surely not obviously valid. Consider the first argument. To say that a being is omnipotent is to say that it could do anything that is logically possible. But it does not obviously follow that if God could do anything, then he would. So if God did not need to act because he is omnipotent, it does not mean that he would not act. So omnipotence and action are not clearly logically incompatible, as Smith seems to argue. The argument proposing to show the incompatibility of omnipotence and omniscience is not obviously valid either. First of all, it is not clear in what sense it is logically possible to change the future. So if God could not change the future, this would hardly be a limitation of his power. But even if it was logically possible in some sense to change the future, it is unclear why this would mean that God could not know the future. Suppose that it is possible to change the future by some action A. Suppose that this means merely that if action A were to be done now, some true proposition P about the future would be false and action A could be done now. Clearly, Martin could know a certain proposition about the future, for example, that he will be alive 1 minute from now, and yet it is possible that he could change the future in the above sense by an act of suicide. If this is possible for a mere mortal, it is certainly possible for God. The upshot, the writer believes, is that Smith is not successful in showing that the concept of a Christian God is contradictory. Unfortunately, Smith does not attempt to argue on inductive grounds that the existence of God is improbable. His arguments are basically a priori. But as Martin has argued elsewhere, and a posteriori approach, for example, in relation to the problem of evil, is a fruitful one for an atheist to take. Although Smith does briefly consider the problem of evil, 76 to 87, pages 76 to 87, he ends up arguing only that the problem drives Christians to agnosticism and blind faith. He does not argue, as Martin believes he should, that the existence of evil makes the existence of God improbable. Smith is wise enough not to claim that the existence of evil contradicts the idea that an all-good, all-powerful God exists. In the second part of the book, Smith contrasts faith and reason and criticizes faith. He argues that faith is based on a deep-seated irrationalism, which in turn is based on an unwarranted skepticism. He rejects skepticism using familiar arguments. Skepticism is self-refuting. For example, the skeptic claims to know we can. Page 155. The skeptic claims to know we cannot know anything. Doubt is always contextual. Universal doubt makes no sense, and skeptics use concepts that have no right to use given their skepticism. He critically evaluates various concepts of faith and appeals to Christian revelation. Unfortunately, in the process, Smith seems to embrace uncritically both the view that logical principles are self-evident and some form of direct realism in the philosophy of perception of 59. In the third part of the book, Smith argues against certain variants of the cosmological and teleological arguments. Smith's criticisms are fairly standard and should be well known to readers of this journal. In the fourth part of the book, Smith attacks religious ethics and contrasts it with what he calls a science of ethics. Ethics as a science guides man's choice relative to certain human ends, such as survival or happiness. Ethics, so conceived, is a rational enterprise. Certain actions are conducive to survival or happiness. Certain actions are not. This can be established by evidence and argument. Ethics construed in this way establishes statements of instrumental value, not intrinsic value. Smith does not attempt to deal with the more difficult questions of what ultimate goals humans should pursue, the question of intrinsic value, but simply posits happiness as man's ultimate ethical goal. Page 286. Religious ethics, on the other hand, is based on uncritical acceptance of authority and sanction, fear of punishment in the afterlife, or the psychological sanction of sin. Page 300. As a result, religious ethics is not conducive to human happiness, and in fact encourages guilt, passivity, and a feeling of helplessness. 310, page 310. These psychological claims about the results of religious beliefs need psychological evidence to support them. Unfortunately, Smith does not supply this evidence. Perhaps the least philosophical but most devastating section of the book for modern Christianity is Smith's analysis of the ethics of Jesus. By citing passages from the New Testament, Smith shows that the ethical views of Jesus are rather different from what liberal Christians like to believe. Jesus is shown as demanding unquestioning obedience, and that all worldly pursuits be forsaken. His doctrines are filled with threats of divine punishment. He demands that reason and independent judgment be forsaken. His views are very sectarian. He came to save the Jews, not the world. Well, they were the chosen people, weren't they? God's chosen. They were supposed to be the holy nation that all knowledge of God would come through, and then they're supposed to eventually teach it, or maybe go up and teach the non-Jews, except non-Jews in their circle, so they too could know the truths about God, the God that they worship, etc., etc. But they rejected Christ when he came, God in flesh, God incarnate. They rejected him. They said, no, you're not the Messiah. No, you're not the Son of God. No, you're blaspheming. And they're looking through their scriptures. By that time, they had been mistranslated or rewritten incorrectly, all this sort of stuff. So that's why they didn't see him in the scriptures, supposedly. And they, when the ages ended, there was 0, and it's supposed to go. It was 0, then it goes to 1 BC or something like that, right? It goes from 1 BC. It goes from 0 to 1 BC, while they just went 0 BC, right? Which should have been 1. So that's supposedly that's what put them out as well. Just what we found through personal research. The golden rule. Okay. Furthermore, Smith argues there is nothing original in Jesus' ethical teaching. The golden rule, for example, was found in Confucianism 500 years earlier. And what was the golden rule? So look at that. Golden rule. Just to clear that up. Golden rule. What was the golden rule? Okay. What was the golden rule? Okay, the golden rule, the most familiar version of the golden rule says, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Moral philosophy has barely taken notice of the golden rule in its own terms, etc., etc. Confucianism believes in ancestor worship and human-centered virtues. So it's all man-based, for living a peaceful life. The golden rule of Confucianism is, do not do unto others what you would not want others to do unto you. There's a debate over if Confucianism is a religion, etc., etc. So if it's 500 years before Jesus said it, could it possibly be 1,000 years or so before, when the Egyptians said it? Or could it be 1,000 years before the Egyptians said it with the Mesopotamians? Or could it be 1,000 years before the Mesopotamians with the Akkadians, or the Babylonians, or the Sumerians, or whoever? Okay. You could say, where did that saying originally come from? Just basic common sense and logic type of rule, right? You know, if you're going to steal from somebody else, somebody's going to steal from you. Pretty common sense, you know, logic and common sense. Okay, can I go back to Michael Martin. All in all, Smith's book provides a lively introduction to atheism. Although professional philosophers will no doubt find fault with many of Smith's arguments, his critical attack should challenge our students and awaken them from their dogmatic slumbers. Okay. Here's some notes. And now we're going to look at another one. Review Atheism, the Case Against God, reviewed by Margaret, Placentra, Johnston. Atheism, the Case Against God is a reissue of a 1979 title by the same name. Author George H. Smith, can either be considered a forerunner of the new atheist writers so popular in the late 2000s, or as someone supplying a summary and capstone to the work. Readers should not let the decades that have passed since the original publication dissuade them from enlightening read. Smith wrote this book as an early 20-something. His polemical style is typical of a youth whose views are clear, somewhat strident and unmoderated by the paradoxes a person is likely to encounter over the course of a long and complex life. As a master of critical thought, he systematically describes and then flawlessly refutes just about every possible argument for the existence of God, cleanly outsmarting and out-reasoning any case a religious apologist could mount. Smith lists 3 requirements for a belief to claim the status of knowledge, and of course traditional religion fails all 3. He makes a particularly good point in stating that those who claim God is unknowable, yet insist they are certain he exists, are not entirely rational. To the extent that reason is a paramount means the truth, Smith's argument neatly destroys the concept of religious faith. His arguments are based on solid reasoning skills and difficult to dismiss, based as they are on a binary sort of logic, where God as a discrete being, separate from all of us, and not a part of the natural universe, must either be declared definitely to exist or not exist. But Smith's strongest contribution in this work is the clarity and finality of his arguments. Separating morality from religious belief, he cleanly refutes the conventional world stereotype of the atheist as an insensitive, immoral cynic. A rational morality is based on standards or values. A religious morality is based on rules. So there be rules and standards and ethics. Religious morality may be described as the denaturalization of values. It divorces the pursuit of values from their natural consequences and relies on sanctions to motivate obedience. While one may not agree with Smith that abortion, drug use, prostitution and porn are victimless crimes, his assertion that in general Christian ethics totally fail to accomplish what an ethical system should have merit. Focused on guilt as it often is, Smith claims religion is profoundly anti-life, especially in terms of its psychological effects. While this may be indisputable with regard to certain forms of religion, Smith's citation of Ayn Rand for support of his premise is less than satisfactory. There is perhaps more valid justification among the proponents of positive psychology. The epilogue, added for this particular version, helps the wisdom and proper audience for the book fall into place. Today's 20 and 30 somethings grew up in a cultural war battlefield of stark disputes between the conservative and progressive worldview. Their understanding of religion is undoubtedly stunted by overexposure to two growth limiting conceptions. One, the over-literalism of the fundamentalist mind, or fundamentalist, and the progressive modernist rejection of all things spiritual in favour of absolute reliance on human reason and the findings of science. Smith's arguments offer a wonderful exercise in critical thought and challenge literal believers towards more comprehensive thought patterns. For example, on what basis can one believe the miracles of Christianity and yet deny the reported miracles of other religions? In the study of spiritual development, we learn that critical reflection on the truths we were brought up with and the resultant distancing from the teachings of our tribe are healthy and a necessity. Important step on the road to a more integrated form of spiritual maturity. Smith provides all the logic anyone would need to make that first move beyond literal religious belief. The arguments he mounts are highly needed by certain segments of our society, young adults now at the perfect age to be critically analysing the truths handed on them by their tribe, and other adults who still have this necessary maturation task before them. Atheism, the case against God, is the perfect antidote to cure pre-critical minds of the spiritual myopia involved in literal and insular religious belief. Once Smith's arguments have been digested, however, one can only hope readers will remain open to other materials with the power to challenge them toward an even more comprehensive and more spiritual inclusive perspective. Margaret Placentra Johnston is a practicing optometrist and the author of Overcoming Spiritual Myopia, A View Toward Peace Among the Religions, September 2018, and Faith Beyond Belief, Stories of Good People Who Left Their Church Behind. So that's two reviews of Atheism, Case Against God by George H. Smith. Okay, here's a foreword by Lawrence M. Krauss. That's that. He's an atheist, but he's like really clever in his field. I remember seeing that guy. Haven't really listened to him much, but yeah, we definitely know he's very clever in his field. So we're going to go back to the book, Atheism, the Case Against God. We're going to have a little read of it. Contents. Continue. Introduction. Does a God exist? This question has undoubtedly been asked in one form or another since man has had the ability to communicate. Men have pondered the question, discussed it, argued it, and killed over it. It appears to be a simple question calling for a simple answer, but its simplicity is deceptive. Thousands of volumes have been written on the subject of a God, and the vast majority have answered the question with a resounding yes. You are about to read a minority viewpoint. This book is a presentation and defense of atheism. This is not a sympathetic examination or interpretation of religious doctrines. It is a straightforward critique, philosophically and psychologically, of the belief in a God, especially as manifested in Christianity. The subtitle, The Case Against God, has a twofold meaning. First, it refers to the philosophical case against the concept of God, and secondly, it refers to the psychological case against the belief in a God. As a philosopher, the writer or the author, continually amazed by the credence given to religious claims in the intellectual community, and as a human being, he was appalled by the psychological damage caused by religious teachings, damage that often takes years to counteract. Atheism, even in today's liberal atmosphere, is still somewhat unacceptable. Simply being an atheist may be acceptable if, that is, one keeps it to oneself. What is frequently considered inappropriate is to advertise this fact, or openly to attack religious doctrines. Thus, some excellent critiques of theistic belief have been written by philosophers who, for reasons known best to themselves, refuse to acknowledge that what they are advocating is, in fact, atheism. And we also have the unfortunate spectacle of the philosopher who, after demolishing the idea of God philosophically, goes on to assure his audience, with a gesture of glib modesty, that he has merely presented his own opinion, and that he is not so presumptuous as to suggest that his listeners should abandon their belief in God. Finally, there is a philosopher or psychologist who, while openly admitting the irrationality of theistic belief, actually recommends it as a kind of therapeutic device designed to give emotional aid and comfort to mankind, thus lending support to the myths that the average man is emotionally incapable of facing facts. It is the writer's firm conviction, or was it writer's firm conviction, that man has nothing to gain, emotionally or otherwise, by adhering to a falsehood, regardless of how comfortable or sacred that falsehood may appear. Anyone who claims on the one hand that he is concerned with human welfare, and who demands on the other hand that man must suspend or renounce the use of his reason, is contradicting himself. There can be no knowledge of what is good for man apart from knowledge of reality and human nature, and there is no manner in which this knowledge can be acquired except through reason. To advocate irrationality is to advocate that which is destructive to human life. I'm going to read that again. Okay, this George A. Smith reckons it was his firm conviction that man has nothing to gain, emotionally or otherwise, by adhering to a falsehood, or something that's not true, or not real, regardless of how comfortable or sacred that falsehood may appear. Anyone who claims on the one hand that he is concerned with human welfare, and who demands on the other hand that man must suspend or renounce the use of his reason, is contradicting himself. I could probably agree with that. There can be no knowledge of what is good for man apart from knowledge of reality and human nature. Not too sure about that one. And there is no manner in which this knowledge can be acquired except through reason. To advocate irrationality is to advocate that which is destructive to human life. It is not the author's purpose to convert people to atheism. Such efforts are usually futile. It was his purpose, however, to demonstrate that the belief in God is irrational to the point of absurdity, and that this irrationality, when manifested in specific religions such as Christianity, is extremely harmful. In other words, he has attempted to remove the veneer of intellectual and moral respectability that often enshrouds the notion of a God. If a person wishes to continue believing in God, that is his prerogative, that he can no longer excuse his belief in the name of reason. But he can no longer excuse his belief in the name of reason and moral necessity. Although this book is intended primarily for laymen, or ordinary everyday Joes, it is impossible to avoid some degree of technicality due to the complexity of many religious doctrines. A writer cannot make an issue simpler than it really is. All he can do, and what this author has attempted to do, is to present the relevant issues as succinctly and clearly as possible, discussing them in terms of the fundamentals, while remaining fair to the various sides under consideration. It is also impossible within the scope of one book to consider every argument ever presented in favour of theistic belief, or to answer every objection that might be raised against atheism, so he has necessarily restricted this discussion to those issues which he considered most important. Didn't the people in the review say that he was arguing against everything, God-wise? Yeah. As a master of critical thought, George H. Smith systematically describes and then flawlessly refutes just about every possible argument for the existence of God, cleanly outsmarting and outreasoning any case a religious apologist could mount. Okay? So he's come up with everything. So no apologist, no religioso could beat him. Yeah? He'd get them every time. That's what it's saying there from this person's review. Margaret Placentra Johnston. That's what she's come to realise about this guy. Okay, this book is divided into 4 major parts. In part 1, the author discusses the nature of theism, atheism, and agnosticism, and he presents the insurmountable problems and contradictions entailed by the concept of God. In part 2, he discusses the nature of reason, demonstrating its incompatibility with faith and revelation. In part 3, he considers it the most significant attempts to demonstrate the existence of a supernatural being through an appeal to reason, showing how each alleged proof fails totally to make its case. In part 4, he discusses the harmful effects of religion in general, in Christianity in particular, upon morality and the attainment of man's happiness and well-being on earth. His approach to atheism is eclectic, in the sense that he draws from many different sources in defence of various positions. In no instance, however, should it be assumed that his use of source implies an agreement with the atheistic position by that source. Similarly, his use of an author in support of a particular position implies his agreement to that extent only, and in no case should further agreement be assumed. Also, it is necessary to mention that he employs the term God in 2 different ways. He uses it with a lowercase g, God, to refer to the generic idea of a God, for example, the general notion of a supernatural being, apart from any specific characteristics. He uses the term God with an uppercase G to refer specifically to the God of Christianity, along with its various attributes such as omnipotence, omniscience, and so forth. This unusual method provides him with a simple means of indicating in any given context whether he is referring to the idea of God in general or to the idea of the Christian God in particular. Finally, he wished to thank many people who aided in the preparation of this book, etc., etc. April 1973, Los Angeles. Part 1. Atheism and God. The writer has put the following work under your protection. Right? This is someone else, Thomas Paine. I put the following work under your protection. It contains my opinion upon religion. You will do me the justice to remember that I have always strenuously supported the right of every man to his opinion, however different that opinion might be to mine. He who denies to another this right makes a slave of himself to his present opinion, because he precludes himself the right of changing it. The most formidable weapon against errors of every kind is reason. I have never used any other, and I trust I never shall. Thomas Paine, Age of Reason. The scope of atheism. 1. The myths of atheism. The fool says in his heart there is no God. They are corrupt. They do abominable deeds. That abominable means wicked or unrighteous. There is none that does good. It's talking about them. Okay? They who do abominable deeds, there is none that do good. This frequently quoted passage captures the essence of how the average religious person views atheism. Not really. Okay, maybe Christians do. Okay, maybe he's right in that way. Okay, this is how God views those who reject him, those who reject the Christ, those who don't want to believe in him, etc., etc. That's what he's saying. That this fool says in his heart there is no God. They are corrupt. They do abominable deeds, wicked deeds, sinful deeds, unrighteous deeds. There is none, in reference to these, that does any good. Atheism is probably the least popular and least understood philosophical position in America today. It is often approached with fear and mistrust, as if one were about to investigate a doctrine that advocates a wide assortment of evils, from immorality, pessimism, and communism to outright nihilism. Atheism is commonly considered to be a threat to the individual and society. It is science divorced from wisdom and fear of God, writes one philosopher, which the world has directly to thank for the worst evils of modern war. There's one there. Is that, unless otherwise noted, all biblical quotations in this book are from the Revised Stand version, 1952. Okay, that's that's the Roman Catholic scriptures translated into the American Americanized modern English and put out into the world. That's one of them. It's not from the original manuscripts. A recent critique of atheism. Vincent P. Maselli claims that every form of atheism, even the initially well-intentioned constructs, shrinks, enslaves the individual atheist within and against himself, and eventually, as atheism reaches plague proportions among men, goes on to enslave and move society. It's probably some reference to some books in the index. Through similar representations of atheism as an evil, destructive force, religionists throughout history have prescribed various forms of punishment for atheists. Plato, in his construction of the ideal state, made impiety a crime, punishable by 5 years imprisonment for the first offence and death upon the second conviction. Jesus, who was offered as a paradigm of love and compassion, threatened that non-believers will be thrown into the furnace of fire, where men will weep and gnash their teeth, just as the weeds are gathered and burned with fire. Matthew 13:40-42. Thomas Aquinas, the great medieval theologian, taught that the sin of unbelief is greater than any sin that occurs in the perversion of morals, and he recommended that the heretic be exterminated from the world by death after the third offence. So that's his opinion. That was his view, Thomas Aquinas. Okay. Just because they may have believed in God doesn't make them godly, right? They may be an actor, a pretender, a role player. Those who have that appearance of being godly, but inwardly they're abominable, they're wicked as. Well, okay, in many states in America wouldn't allow an atheist to testify in court, and his Supreme Court of Tennessee in 1897 published this remarkable statement. Some questions here that he poses. The meaning of atheism. Theism is defined as a belief in a god or gods. The term theism is sometimes used to designate the belief in a particular kind of god, the personal god of monotheism, but as used throughout this book, theism signifies a belief in any god or number of gods. The prefix a, without, so the term atheism literally means without theism, or without belief in a god of gods. Atheism, therefore, is the absence of theistic belief. One who does not believe in the existence of a god or supernatural being is properly designated as an atheist. Okay, so yep, that's what we were doing. We were looking at these words and we were defining them, but we were told no, stop looking at the definitions. Look at why the definitions go by this particular book. But here, it's promoting the definitions from the Greek, as we did in our comments, right? Or in our video. Okay. Yeah, so atheism, without theism, or without or no theism, right? But here's the problem. The first atheists were Christians, as we put in our video. We read about it years and years ago, and then it came up in this video. We read it from this particular book, that the Romans, certain Romans called these Christians atheists because they wouldn't worship the goddesses or the gods, etc., that they worshipped. They even refused to worship the emperors. That suddenly came up with the idea that they were descendant of God or gods, all that sort of stuff. They wouldn't take part in the bull sacrifices, other pagan practices that the Romans were doing. At first, the emperors said, "Oh, just leave them alone. They're not really a problem. They're no problem." But somebody kept pushing. Oh yeah, but they should be doing what we're doing. Why not? Why aren't they doing it? Some Christians, to take the pressure off them, they actually did it. Did these practices, etc. But these other ones said, no, it's all pagan. We're not doing it. So eventually, a decree was put out, and these Christians were persecuted, chucked in the arenas, etc. Hung up and used as candles, or not candles, torches, human torches, so people could see when they walked through the gardens and stuff like that. But in that day and age, they were called atheists. They were the first atheists, called that by the Romans. So, how could they have been without God? Right? They were without their gods, the Roman gods. Okay? They were saying no to the Roman gods, pagan gods. So that's what it would mean in that sense. Without gods. Okay? Atheism is sometimes defined as the belief that there is no God of any kind, or the claim that God cannot exist. While these are categories of atheism, they do not exhaust the meaning of atheism, and they are somewhat misleading with respect to the basic nature of atheism. Atheism in its basic form is not a belief, it is the absence of belief. Well, we defined it, okay, and it seemed to hint at that it was a belief. There has to be a belief. If you don't believe in a God, or any God exists, okay, you have a belief. It's not like a belief system, it's just a belief that there is no God. There's no God and no gods, or any gods. Okay? You've determined it in your mind that there is no God, or no gods. An atheist is not primarily a person who believes that a God does not exist, rather he does not believe in the existence of a God. Let's go have a look at the word again. And let's define it, because that's what they're doing, they're defining it. Atheist. Atheist defined. We'll put the D. What does it say? Atheist is a naming word. A person who does not believe in the existence of a God or any gods. Believe. He does not believe. One who subscribes to or advocates atheism. Atheism, Wikipedia. Writers disagree on how best to define and classify atheism, contesting what supernatural entities are considered gods, whether atheism is a philosophical position in its own right, or merely the absence of one, or a god, and whether it requires a conscience, explicit rejection, etc. etc. Cambridge Dictionary. Someone who does not believe in any god or gods, or who believes that no god or god exists. Britannica. This is a 250-year-old encyclopedia. Atheism in general, the critique and denial of metaphysical beliefs in God or spiritual beings. Anything God related. As such, it is usually distinguished from theism, which affirms the reality of the divine and often seeks to demonstrate its existence. Atheism is also distinguished from agnosticism. It makes it different, which leaves open the question of whether there is a God or not, professing to find the question unanswered, etc. etc. Atheist.org. Atheism is one thing, a lack of belief in gods. That's from atheist.org. Atheism is one thing, a lack of belief in gods. so they don't believe that there's gods or a god. Atheism is not an affirmative belief that there is no God, nor does it answer any other question about what a person believes. It is simply a rejection of the assertion that there are gods. So it's contradictory, isn't it? If it says atheism is not an affirmative belief, or a fixed belief, or a determined belief that there is no God, nor does it answer any other question about what a person believes. It is simply a rejection of the assertion that there are gods, a god or any gods, right? It's saying to you one thing, that it's not an affirmative belief that there is no God, yet here it says it's simply a rejection of the assertion that there are gods. It's a rejection. It's like saying, no, we don't believe there's any God or gods. And it goes, atheism is too often defined incorrectly as a belief system. Yeah, that's right, it's not a belief system, but it's something they believe in. It's not like religion, like Christianity or whatever. That's a belief system. Yeah. And then it goes on to say it's not a disbelief in gods. What did it say up here? That there is no God. A rejection of assertion that there are gods. And Christians telling them there's definitely God. They're like, no, there is no God. Okay. There are as many reasons for being an atheist as there are atheists. The road to atheism tends to be very personal and individual, based upon the specific circumstances of a person's life, experiences and attitudes. Nevertheless, it is possible to describe some general similarities which tend to be common among quite a few atheists. So at some point you may make a choice. It sounds all confusing, it sounds contradictory. I don't believe in God because of that basis, so I'm an atheist. This is what Bart D. Ehrman said when he explained himself, when he was asked to define for us why he called himself an agnostic atheist, and he gave that definition, which is really weird, but he's agnostic. It's like he wasn't really sure that there was a God, right? And then he decided there is no God because it's all contradictory, all that sort of stuff. He didn't believe there was no God. He didn't believe there was a God. He didn't believe in God. Basically, that's what he's saying, right? So he's combined the two, but they're two different definitions. One is he's not really sure. He doesn't have that knowledge. He doesn't know. He's on the fence in regards to God, but then being an atheist, admitting he's an atheist, says, I don't believe in God, or he doesn't believe in God anymore. So he doesn't believe in God, right? What is atheism? Define atheism. Atheism defined. The word atheism comes from the negative a, which means no, and theos, which means God. So that's Greek, right? From the Greek, which means God. Which means no, and theos, which means God in the Greek. Since atheism is the most basic term, means no God. Basically, atheism is the lack of belief in a God and or the belief that there is a God. That atheism is the lack of belief in a God and or the belief that there is no God. There you go. There's certainly very, very more many other definitions. So let's go have a look at the etymology, the origin of the word. We looked at this and defined it, explained it in our previous video. 1570s, a godless person, one who denies the existence of a supreme intelligent being to whom moral obligation is due. From the French atheiste, 16th century, from Greek atheos, without God, denying the gods, abandon of the gods, godless, ungodly, from a or a, without, and theos, a god. So they're without a god. Without a god. He's got a little note here. The existence, or quote, the existence of a world without God seems to me less absurd than the presence of a God existing in all its perfection, creating an imperfect man in order to make him run the risk of hell. Aman Salacro, Certitudes et Incertitudes, 1943. Okay, here's the prefix meaning not, without, or without. Prefix meaning not or without, from Greek and not, the alpha privative. Okay. So they have no God, or they're without God. So there you have it. Yeah. So we've defined theism. What's theism? Pretty sure we defined that. Let's have a look. If it helps. Theism, definition and meaning, Merriam-Webster. The meaning of theism is belief in the existence of a God or gods. So, atheism would be a belief that a God or gods don't exist. A belief in the non-existence of a God or any gods. This would probably be what it means. Okay. Theism, religion, Britannica. Theism, the view that all limited or finite things are dependent in some way on one supreme or ultimate reality, of which one may also speak in personal terms. In Judaism, Christianity and Islam, this ultimate reality is often called God. And the article explores approaches to theism and Western theology and philosophy. Theism's view of God can be clarified by contrasting it with those of deism. And there's more definitions of theism. Now, the doctrine or belief in the existence of a God or gods. What is a theist? What is theism? Types of theism. What is theism? There's many definitions, or dictionaries with the definition. Anti-theism, also spelled anti-theism, is a philosophical position that theism should be opposed. The term has had a range of applications in secular contexts. If it typically refers to direct opposition to the belief in any deity. So the Greek is no or without, and theos is God. So these are godless, those who abandon the gods, etc., etc. You have to define it to fully understand it. But as this person said, no, you can't do that, you just got to read this book. Yeah, good to read both, and realise both sides of the coin. Yeah, makes you think. Does God exist? Maybe God doesn't exist. Where's the evidence? Etc., etc. So that's part one. Well, that's the end of this particular video. Hopefully it wasn't too long. Where we looked at this book about atheism as suggested. We probably will do a part two, because it's quite an interesting book. So if you enjoyed it, subscribe to our channel, give us a like, Add your comments below. Keep them nice, and we'll get back to you as soon as we can. And then go share this video with your family, friends, neighbours and others who perhaps are puzzled what exactly is an atheist.